Well, there is no doubt that the Russians would be hoping that a reciprocal move by Ukraine would be to stop deep attacks into Russia. I think the Russian military high command and President Putin would like to see those attacks stopping. So it may be that offering a ceasefire in the air is a way of taking pressure off himself and taking pressure off the Russian people. But I think these are all ploys that are being played into a future negotiation. Of course, there are wider issues here that if Putin and Trump agree some kind of deal, that President Zelensky is not able to agree to, there is a danger that the Americans will decide to withdraw their support from Ukraine. This will be a major challenge for European countries like mine to decide whether to continue to support Ukraine even without American assistance. And I think this is an issue that President Zelensky is currently talking with President Macron, Chancellor Merz, and Prime Minister Starmer, amongst others at the present moment, to see what the European position would be. Personally, I believe it will be right, and I'm sure that the United Kingdom and other European countries will go on supporting Ukraine, but it will be increasingly difficult to do so without active and significant American military support.
If there is a ceasefire deal in the air, do you expect US President Trump to put even more pressure on Vladimir Putin after the possible ceasefire in the air to achieve full unconditional ceasefire on the ground?
Yes, I think that a ceasefire in the air would be a first step towards a wider ceasefire. But of course, from a European security point of view, there is another aspect that's important, and that is that, of course, once the Russians stop their attacks on the ground and in the air, then it gives them a chance to refurbish their military, to resupply their ammunition depots, and if there is not a wider settlement in Europe, for them to consider testing the strength of NATO by pressing some form of attack, maybe against one of the Baltic states, to test NATO's resolve to stand by Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which is an attack on one member is an attack on all. So there are dangers for wider European security in there being a ceasefire in Ukraine, because it will provide an opportunity for the Russians to strengthen themselves to possibly press elsewhere. So there are many angles that have to be looked at here, not just the one from Ukraine, which of course from your people's point of view is the most important, and I fully understand that.
Also, let's cover sanctions against Russia. New sanctions against Russia should still be imposed this Friday, a White House official told Reuters. What is your assessment of this strategy of US President Donald Trump to negotiate with the Russians but still impose sanctions on Putin's war machine? And do you expect these sanctions to be imposed on Friday to be less harsh, less effective, rather than these sanctions which were discussed previously before negotiations in Moscow?
Well, Donald Trump likes to impose deadlines. We've seen that much more widely in his trade war and threat of tariff sanctions being applied to other countries. So far, it seems that Vladimir Putin is resistant to American timeline ultimatums. So I think the next 24 hours are going to be very interesting to see whether there is a realistic possibility of Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump not just talking on the telephone, but maybe meeting face to face and seeing if there are grounds for some form of ceasefire. If those potential talks collapse, then unless Donald Trump is going to very publicly walk back from his ultimatum, walk back from the red lines that he's imposed, then he will have no option but to impose further sanctions on Russia, and also further sanctions on countries like India, who he criticizes for buying Russian oil. And then, of course, there is also the issue of China. America is in a very tight negotiation with China on trade issues. America wants to have a reasonable relationship with China. But given that China is buying a lot of Russian oil, the question has to be, what will Trump's attitude be towards China buying Russian oil? This is another complicating factor. So none of these things are straightforward, and there are many interwoven threads that all come together, which make these potential negotiations really quite difficult, very difficult.
If these negotiations between the US and Russia collapse, do you feel that President Trump has enough leverage over Russia to try to fully impose the sanctions? And does President Trump have enough leverage again over India and China to fully prevent these countries from buying Russia's crude oil?
I think if this potential round of negotiations collapses, then Donald Trump will not have many other options other than to impose more sanctions on Russia, and certainly trade sanctions on India with regard to buying Russian oil. And he'll have to decide what he's going to do with China, whether he's going to risk the relationship that he has with China and put more pressure on President Xi of China by imposing trade sanctions on China to deter them from buying Russian oil. So there's a lot at stake on whether these negotiations begin, whether they succeed, or whether they collapse. And if they collapse, then I think the Americans will have to up their support to you in Ukraine in military terms, but also put more pressure on the economic front on Russia in a variety of ways.
The US has also reached this deal with NATO to provide Ukraine with weapons, and Europe, NATO countries are paying for these new shipments of weapons from the US to Ukraine. What is your reaction to this new form of cooperation between the US and European allies?
Well, the important thing for Ukraine is that more weapons and more ammunition and other forms of support are made available. I think what is clever from Donald Trump's point of view is that he's saying to the Europeans, yes, we'll supply more stuff, but you buy it, and American defense companies will manufacture these things, and then we will ship them to Ukraine. So from Donald Trump's point of view, if he goes down that track, he will feel he's doing the right thing by making more support available to Ukraine, but he will also feel that economically he's doing the right thing by persuading European countries to buy American defense equipment, and that then be given to Ukraine. Now, having said that, there is nothing to stop European countries increasing their own industrial capacity, their own industrial output, for the European countries to produce more weapons and ammunition and to gift or loan that to Ukraine themselves. I think we'll see a combination of these things happening if there is a breakdown in negotiations.
Let's also cover recent nuclear escalation between the US and Russia. US President Donald Trump has moved 2 nuclear submarines towards Russia in response to nuclear threats from Dmitry Medvedev, who now serves as deputy chairman of the Russia's Security Council. What is your take on this escalation and on this clash between President Trump and Dmitry Medvedev?
Well, I think most commentators believe that Dmitry Medvedev does not speak for the Kremlin at the present moment. And he's been pretty outspoken and has rattled the nuclear saber many times over the last 3 or 4 years or so. And he's done that again. Now, Donald Trump made one of his rather impromptu statements that he was going to move 2 nuclear submarines nearer to Russia. Well, the United States of America has got a lot of nuclear submarines, whether they're nuclear powered or nuclear weapons capable, and neither you nor I know where they are in the ocean at the present time. So in a sense, it was a predictable response to what Medvedev was saying, but I think most commentators are, while concerned, are not too concerned about the implications of that.
And do you feel that this decision of President Trump could trigger another escalation or some type of nuclear escalation between the US and Russia? Because many people in the West are far really concerned about the risks of such escalation after this decision?
Well, it's interesting and dangerous that we're having this conversation 80 years on from when the world's only two atomic bombs were dropped 80 years ago in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think the world has been reminded once again just how devastating these kind of weapons are. And I don't think it's in anybody's rational interest to seriously consider using nuclear weapons, even a so-called smaller tactical nuclear weapon. I also think that in the relationship between China and Russia, President Xi would put a very strong restraining hand on Putin if he thought the Russians were thinking about using a nuclear weapon, even a small one. I think that restraint which China would impose over Russia, I think is an encouraging thing. Yes, the nuclear threat remains, but it's not in anybody's interest to cross that nuclear threshold and start a nuclear exchange, even at the tactical level.
You just mentioned about China. Recently there was interesting publication of many details from the latest meetings between European and Chinese officials, and according to these publications, China does not want to see Russia losing this war in Ukraine. What is your assessment of the Chinese position in this regarding the outcome of this war?
Well, China and Russia have formed a very close relationship, and I think China would not want to see its partner, Russia, humiliated or embarrassed, and therefore will endeavor to go on supporting. But I think that support is measured. I think that support also is tempered by the remark I was making just now, that I think the Chinese leadership will continue to place restraint on the Russian leadership not to consider using nuclear weapons. So I think we have to watch that relationship very closely, but remember that China is the dominant partner in that relationship now, and that Russia is quite dependent on China in many ways, not the least of which is its ability to export some of its oil and gas to China, just in the same way that it's doing to India.
Let's cover our final topics, European nuclear deterrence and UK's nuclear deterrence. Recently, the US has repositioned nuclear and other nuclear assets to the United Kingdom for the first time since 2008. What is your reaction to this, and does it mean that the UK doesn't still need any type of tactical nukes to be produced?
Well, deterrence is all about preventing another country, another state, another party to do something. And you can only deter what someone else might do if your deterrent capability is itself credible. And I think what the United Kingdom has realized, that yes, we have our strategic nuclear deterrent with the continuous at-sea submarine patrol program, but unlike in the years of the Cold War, we don't have a smaller, lower level tactical weapon capability. And the steps are being taken by purchasing 12 F-35A type aircraft that we could provide for ourselves a lower level nuclear capability, which will thicken up and broaden overall deterrence and therefore make the potential use of nuclear exchange less likely. So I think it's the right thing to do to make sure that the United Kingdom, like France and certainly like the United States, has got a nuclear deterrent capability, not just at the strategic level, but at the tactical level as well.
And also, what is your assessment of the current state of relations between the UK and the US and other NATO allies? Is Trump's administration is back committed to European security? Right now, there have been lots of discussions about the possibility of withdrawal of the US troops from Europe. It seems like these discussions are now being on a lower level. What is your take on that?
Well, this is all part of the wider discussion that's been going on for some time. President Trump is right insofar as European countries need to take a greater share of responsibility for our overall security. That's the security of Europe, including the security of Ukraine. But what is absolutely fundamental to NATO is that even if the United States is going to do less in Europe, we must keep the United States as part of NATO. That is extraordinarily important. So the balancing act that's got to be performed successfully by European leaders is to show that they are determined to play their full part in the security of Europe, allowing the allowing the Americans to focus more widely elsewhere, particularly in the Middle East and in the Indo-Pacific, in order to keep the Americans engaged, but recognize that America may do less to contribute towards European security and that we Europeans must do more for ourselves.
Do you feel that Vladimir Putin has understood that he has overplayed his hand several weeks ago during this long phone calls between Trump and Putin, and his actions lead to Trump's frustration?
Yes, I think he does at this point. It's not clear to me whether Putin made this mistake unintentionally, whether he did it, he pushed the envelope as far as he could to see how much he could get away with, or he just did it intentionally because he didn't care. I think we can conclude now that he does want to repair things between him and Trump if he can. So I'm sure he's given a lot of attention to how to do that. You know, he was never going to say to Trump, I plan to fight this war until Ukraine is once again part of the Russian Empire. He's going to say he wants peace. And that's why I think presenting either a full-fledged peace plan or at least some kind of interim agreement proposal that would mitigate some of the ongoing hostilities would put him in a good light with Trump. I don't think that means Putin is back down on his ultimate objectives at all. I think this is part of a charm offensive with an audience of one, and that's Donald Trump.
And could these negotiations lead to a full ceasefire until the end of this year, from your perspective?
Well, I would be doubtful of that. I think there are too many complexities here. When people first heard the phrase ceasefire in the air in the United States, they thought, well, that would protect Ukraine from attacks on civilian infrastructure and civilian populations that Russia has been waging. But it would necessarily also preclude long-range strikes inside Russia of the kind Ukraine has perfected. And to me, maybe even more concerning is if the drone operations of both sides had to cease, I think that would disadvantage Ukraine potentially the worst. So I'm worried about it. I'm worried about a ceasefire that freezes the front lines in place, because I'm afraid that's the next step to de facto partition along those front lines. So a ceasefire, as attractive as it sounds, has a lot of potential downsides for Ukraine. And there are plenty of precedents where the sides in a conflict have negotiated while simultaneously fighting. That's nothing to reject out of hand.
US President Trump has been threatening to impose sanctions and tariffs on those countries which are buying Russia's oil. He has already imposed additional 25% tariff on Indian goods from India. Do you see this development as another reason why Vladimir Putin is trying to pretend to be more willing to reach a deal?
Well, I think he's hoping to use the imposition of the secondary tariffs on India to Russia's advantage. And I think he would try and do it in this way. The Indians have already said publicly they're going to continue their purchases of Russian oil and gas. So if that holds, then Russia will suffer no pain. It will be India that suffers the pain. So I could see Putin asking Trump to eliminate that secondary tariff against India, to say, look, they're not part of this. They shouldn't be disadvantaged. And if Trump says no, then the Indians are going to be even more outraged than they are now and grow closer to the Russians. It's also the case that the Chinese, who buy significantly greater oil and gas amounts from Russia than India, have not yet been hit with secondary tariffs, which outrages the Indians even more. So this is a case where competing strategic objectives may be at odds with one another, And Trump has put himself in this situation without thinking about it. But I would worry that Putin could outmaneuver Trump and actually work this to his advantage.
From your perspective, what are the chances that these negotiations could collapse in the near time?
Well, I think it's in Russia's advantage now, if indeed it was Putin who asked for the meeting, to string them out a while. If they could force Zelensky into the position of being the one who gave a thumbs down on negotiation, to make it look like he was the one who was against peace, who was obstructing Trump's efforts, they would do it as soon as they could. But after a while, as these things go on, with Trump's attention span being what it is, he may well turn to something else. So I don't think it's in Russia's interest in the near term to see these talks end quickly. The more they drag on, particularly with a ceasefire that freezes the front lines in their current form, I think it's something that on net it helps the Russians.
From your perspective, if such negotiations collapse, will President Trump be able to force Putin to renew these negotiations? Does Trump have enough leverage over Vladimir Putin right now? Because there have been lots of discussions that Trump doesn't have enough leverage to force Putin to sit at the negotiating table to reach appropriate deal, because he has some problems with imposing tariffs on China and other countries.
Well, I think that's a big question. China is the hardest question, but I believe the statistics show that Turkey, a NATO ally, is the third biggest purchaser of Russian oil and gas. And in part, these countries are going to say, look, what we're doing is not illegal under your own sanctions. The sanctions say the U.S. and EU will not import Russia oil or gas, but others may buy oil in this case as long as they keep it below the $60 per barrel price cap. And India in particular said, that's all we're doing. We're going to buy oil cheaply, and your own sanctions permit this. So I think Trump's ability to force Putin back to the table is limited unless Trump were to say unequivocally, I'm going to continue as far as the eye can see U.S. military assistance, weapons, ammunition, and military intelligence in particular, or even increase it. That would be the kind of pressure that would be felt by the Russian forces on the battlefront that could make a difference with Russia. We don't have any indication at this point, though, that that's what Trump would do.
You just mentioned about the security assistance for Ukraine. What is your take on this deal between US and NATO to provide Ukraine with weapons in exchange to European money?
Well, I think it's important. I think Ukraine can use the Patriots, and Trump can say, see, I'm making money off of it, which he cares to be able to say more than almost anything else. But it doesn't, that decision alone, even though it was the correct decision, doesn't tell you anything about the future supply of military assistance. I think there's overwhelming support in Congress to continue doing it, but to be effective for Ukraine, and maybe also to put more pressure on Putin, Trump has to be explicit about it, which he has not yet done.